What we do in life is ever changing. It has to be attuned to circumstance and to the environment, and particularly in the life in which we live, which is so volatile. What we do has to be very agile. We've got to be able to pivot and change what we do. How we do it is never changing. So how we do it is governed by halachot, it's governed by principles, it's governed by our covenant with Hashem, our bris with Hashem, as to the way we live our lives. What we do, the way we express ourselves changes, how we do it doesn't change. And I often talk about the difference between the sun and the moon, that the moon is ever changing. Every night it looks different. You never know where it's going to rise, when it's going to rise, where it's going to set. You never know where to look for the moon. You would think comes Kiddush Levana, everybody would know where the moon should be. But people go out and they're looking and searching for the moon. That doesn't happen with the sun. You know exactly where the sun is all the time. It's always in the place it's meant to be. It follows a very strict schedule, and we know what it is. And in Torah, we synthesize, we synchronize the ever-changing and the never-changing, the lunar calendar and the solar calendar. You have to be good at both. You have to understand and live by the never-changing principles of halakha and the ever-changing strategies of life, of what we do. The Korban Oleh veYored is an example of an adaptable korban. It changes according to the socio-economic level of the particular person bringing it. Does he bring an ox? Does he bring a sheep? Does he bring a bird? Does he bring a korban mincha? How it's brought is governed by strict halachot. That makes no difference how wealthy or poor you are. There's particular halachot for each of those. And one of the halachot that permeates all of the korbanot, of the Oleh veYored for sure, but in fact all of the korbanot, is that little significant halakha of having to have salt on a korban. And it's for that reason that we still put salt on the table to this day. We have salt on our tables for a meal. The din, the halakha, is to have it on the table. Everybody dips their challah into it, or they sprinkle the salt over the challah. Sprinkling the salt over the challah is for a different reason. That's almost an insult to the challah baker. That's if the challah doesn't taste good, you have to have salt on it if you're going to use it for motzi. Dipping the challah into the salt, that's in the Zohar. That's a matter of Kabbalah. The halakha is salt on the table. That's all we have to do, salt on the table. So I sometimes dip the challah into it, because if I have people at the table, they'll think I'm not frum if I don't dip it into the thing. So I dip the challah, otherwise they'll... But that's not the halakha. The halakha is to have salt on the table. And we'll understand deeply today why that's the halakha. Having salt on the table is the important thing. As we explore this concept of covenant, Brit Amora במלח, Menachos Daf Yomi Menachot. There are various different psukim that the Gemara is based on. The one is a posuk in Bamidbar. There's a machlokes between Rabbi Lapin, the Tosfos, and the way we have the Gemara as to whether that's actually the posuk that we are referring to, whether that's the verse that we're referring to. But let's work the way we've got it in our Gemara, and that is when you give the different parts to the Kohen. The posuk says the different parts of the korban that the kohen is entitled to. Brit melach olam hi lifnei Hashem l'chal uzaracha itcha. I've made this an eternal covenant with the kohanim that they will always get these portions. Then we have psukim in Vayikra, where we have v'chol korban minchatcha b'melech timlach v'lo tashbit melach brit elokecha me'al minchatecha. Again, we have salt referred to as Brit, as covenant. On all your Mincha sacrifices, this idea is introduced to us through the Mincha. And on all the Mincha sacrifices, we learn from there, not only the Mincha, but on all of them, there should be Melach Brit Elokecha, salt, which is the covenant of Hashem. And then V'ayta lo lezaro acharav Brit Kuhunat Olam. Again, back to the Kohanim. This should be in Bamidbar. Is another posuk where it's a Brit. This is a covenant forever. The Gemara is discussing a law of Rav, a halacha of Rav that we have at the top of Yud Tet Amud Bet, where Rav says that if the Torah repeats a halacha twice in the laws of Korbanot, particularly in Menachot, then it's to tell you that not only ought you to do it, we learned lechatchila and b'diavad, this is not only lechatchila that you should do it, it's b'diavad as well. If you didn't do it, it's asur, it's pasul, it doesn't work. That's what the repetition of a halacha is. So the Gemara says, what about salt? Salt, we know, if you don't do the salt, it's a problem. You've got to have salt on the korban. We'll see the details as we go through. And if that's the case, but the law of salt is not stated explicitly twice anywhere. And even though we've learned psukim here, lo tashbit melach brit elokecha, and so on, it's an implication. We learn from there that you've got to have salt on the korban, and we learn various other things from these psukim as well. But the law that you've got to have salt on the korban, we don't learn from these psukim. We learn it through various connections. Rabbi Shimon says, "Ne'emar kan brit melech olam hu, v'ne'emar lahalan brit kunat olam." It says in our psukim, this is a covenant of salt. It says in Bamidbar, Brit Melach Olamhu, and it says in our psukim, Brit Kunat Olam. This is an eternal Brit, and it says in Bamidbar, it's an eternal Brit of salt. So wherever there's an eternal Brit, there has to be salt, and since the Korban is called an eternal Brit, there has to be salt there as well. That's Rabbi Shimon. That's how Rabbi Shimon wants to learn it. Rabbi Yehuda learns it just from the posuk of Brit Melach Olam Hu Shetahei Brit Amora Bemelach, that Hashem made a deal with salt right at the beginning of Bereshis. Says Rashi, I've quoted up at the top under the posuk, Shehabrit Kruta LeMelach Misheshit Yemei Bereshit Shuvtechu Mayim Tachtonim Likarev LaMizbeach. That when Hashem separated the upper moisture from the lower moisture, He made a deal with the lower moisture that it will have an opportunity of importance, of elevation. The upper waters are in Shamayim, they're in the atmosphere. The lower waters on the earth will be elevated in the Mizbeach, and salt represents that elevation, as does the pouring of water on Sukkot. So from these psukim we learn that you've got to bring salt. Explains Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and I've told you that during Vayikra, if you want to understand and get a feeling for the korbanot, you can't learn Vayikra without Hirsch. And he says, Brit hi havtacha lelo tnai. This is a Hirsch back in Bereshis, in Perek Vav in Bereshis. Hirsch says, Brit is havtacha lelo tnai, unconditional contract, unconditional promise. It's not dependent on changing circumstances. This is a very beautiful Hebrew translation. Pish was written in Hebrew for many years. We've had an English translation, but the Feldheim Hebrew translation is absolutely gorgeous. He explains here in beautiful Hebrew, this is a promise that is not connected to external circumstances. Even contrary to external circumstances. It's absolute, cut off, mikol kesher shel siba musuvar. That's why we call it lichrot brit, to cut a deal. They still say now, to cut a deal. Here we're talking about of cutting a brit because you're cutting it off from anything around it. It stands on its own. It's self-standing. That's what it means. It's without a condition. This is one of the very rare cases that I'm quoting Rabbi Sachs, because his words are just so beautiful as he builds an entire essay on this piece of Hirsch. Just this little piece of Hirsch, he builds an entire beautiful essay on it called Contracts and Covenants, where he says a contract is a transaction, a covenant is a relationship. Or to put it slightly differently, a contract is about interests. A covenant is about identity. It's about you and me coming together to form an us. That is why contracts benefit, but covenants transform. A Brit transforms. It changes the whole situation. And Hirsch, now back on our parsha in Vayikra, just a beautiful piece. Anu magiim lemaskana shemelach miyatzeg ishtanut. He talks about salt. On the one hand, it flavors food. On the other hand, it stops decay because it avoids change. It preserves. It preserves things as they are and doesn't allow the creation of new bacteria and things that would cause it to decay. So it's preservation. And therefore we come to the conclusion that salt represents hishtanut, never changingness. Shikein melach yotze chotem magem al davar, and so on. Umagein alav mehashpaot mibachutz alulot l'shanoto. And it protects something from the influences from round about that could change it, like bacteria. And therefore salt is the absolute metaphor for Brit, for covenant. And he goes on to discuss it. This Brit that is signified with salt in korbanot, kriya Brit Elokecha, is called the covenant with your God. It must be talking about that Brit which sits in the Aron, in the ark of the Mishkan. Hanikra b'shel kach Aron Brit Hashem, because that's called the ark of the covenant of God. That's what the ark is. That's what the Aron is. Nimtza shemelach hu simla shel haTorah. So when we talk about salt, we're talking about the Torah. We're talking about that which is in the ark. Don't the people get all taken up with the external metaphors and what they mean? Get to the essence. The essence is, it represents that which is sitting inside the Aron. As he says, hakayemet la'ad lelo shinui, because the Torah is like salt, is never changing. The Torah doesn't change. Mitzvat melicha mashmuta hu henefo kach. Therefore, the mitzvah of salting the korban, yesh limloach et hakorban mikol tzadadav b'melach haTorah. You've got to flavor, you've got to salt, you've got to pickle the korban on all its sides with the salt of Torah. Havi omer shehakorban tzarich liot safug kulo berucha shel haTorah nitzchik. As we said yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, the essence of avodah is not hakrova, is not korban. The essence of service of God is not self-sacrifice. The self-sacrifice is the way to do it. The essence of it is to be kulo safug berucha shel haTorah nitzchit, to make sure that it's completely saturated with the eternal Torah. Hashmura v'hamugenet lelo shinui al yedei ha'umah. Rak be'emtzaut haTorah yuchal davar meruchoshenu. Only through Torah could something of our property, something so physical as our property, kometzu levona, that's the image of our property, our product, our produce. Lefarnes et esha elokit alei adamot. How can that nourish the divine flame of divine energy? How can you take something physical and combust divine energy with something physical? It's only if it comes with Torah. And only through Torah can our ambitions, our cravings, the emurim, u'ma'aseinu, the evorim, la'avi la'ashrat shchinat Hashem ba'olam hazeh. How can such physical things as our cravings and our deeds, represented by the inner part, those parts of the korban that are brought on the mizbeach, and those limbs that are given to the kohanim or brought on the mizbeach, how can they bring the Shekhinah into this world? This meeting place of the physical and the spiritual, where we take things that are the most physical, and with them we bring that which is the most spiritual, the Shekhinah itself. And you remember my shir on Zvachim Daf Nun Gimel, where we called it the kiss. And there we talked about the Mizbeach being the place where Binyamin and Yehuda come together in a touch of intimacy. That it's also the place where the Shekhinah and Klal Yisrael come together, where the human being and the divine meet in that embrace, in that moment of kiss. That's what the Mizbeach is. And that can only be done with the Torah. And he says, the conditions by which we earn our livings continuously change. And therefore the way we earn our living also changes. And therefore our goals, our ambitions, our desires also change. All of that changes as life changes. The styles change and fashions change. That's all part of living in history. So you might think mistakenly that we should also change halakha. Have you ever heard that said? Halakha has to keep up with the times. No! Halakha is the only thing that doesn't have to keep up with the times. Yes, you've got to know how to apply it to the times. But the essence, the halachic principles of the Torah are the only things in our lives that shouldn't keep up with the times. They're the never-changing piece. And I might think, since the way I live and the way I work and the way I earn my living and do business changes, so also must the halachot. No. What I do changes. What kind of business I do changes. Do I plow the earth? Do I work in a factory? Do I sit at a computer? Do I work with artificial intelligence? That changes all the time. But the halachot that govern the way you do it never change. They're always the same. Tmurat Eitim, and so he goes on, and therefore he says the Korban Mincha, which we've discussed as being the essence of produce, of the results of your business, of your efforts. It's not sacrificing yourself, it's sacrificing your product. That's why the idea of salt is introduced in the Korban Mincha, because I might have thought in the area of product, there's most reason for agility and change. And yes, while there's reason for agility and change in what we do, there's no agility and change in how we do it, and that's the salt. Then therefore we understand why memlicha is brought for the mincha, and why the Rambam in fact says that only in the Korban Mincha, that if there's no salt, that in other korbanot, if there's no salt, the korban is still kosher. You've been over a love, you've done something wrong by bringing an unsalted korban onto the mizbeach, but the Rambam says it's still, the korban is still kosher, except the mincha. Because the mincha is the area where you most are likely to make the mistake that you don't need salt, that it's never changing. You might think the mincha, because it's about our professions and our work, that it changes. It doesn't change, not the way we do it. And that's how the Rambam brings. What's interesting is the Rambam brings these halachot in Hilchot Isurei Mizbeach. This is not part of the Avodah. This is a law of the Mizbeach. That's really very interesting. It's not like all the other things that are part of the Avodah. This is part of the Mizbeach. And there's a beautiful Meshech Chochmah, which we won't have a chance to look into detail, where he disagrees with Rashi in explaining the Machlokes Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Rashi says there's no difference between them, it's just what posuk they're learning from. And the Meshech Chochmah says, no, there is a difference, because according to Rabbi Shimon, this is a law that applies only to the Kohanim at the Mizbeach, but not to a Bama. In the days when you were allowed to bring a korban outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you didn't need salt. And I was wondering, where does the Meshech Chochmah get that from? He's disagreeing with Rashi. But we see the Rambam brings this in Hilchot Isurei Mizbeach. He doesn't bring this in the laws of Avodah. He brings this in the laws of the Mizbeach. This is a law of Mizbeach, because what's important to look at is the timing. When do you put salt on the Mizbeach? Yes, you put salt on the korban before you put it onto the Mizbeach. So it's before it touches the Mizbeach. But the way the Rambam words it, and where the Rambam places this halacha, the issue is that what you put on the Mizbeach is salted. To do that, you've got to salt it before. But this is a law on the Mizbeach. It's what you put on the altar is salted. So once again, this is not about the avodah. This is not about something that you need to do. This is about that moment of that kiss between the Ribono Shel Olam and Am Yisrael, the Jewish people and the divine Shechina come together on the Mizbeach. That coming together is governed by the never-changing principles of halakha. That's governed by salt. And that's why salt, you don't have to dip your food in the salt. That would be if the salt is part of the avodah. If that's part of the practice, it's part of the service, so you've got to salt your food, your motzi at the table. No, this is a law in the mizbeach. Table is a mizbeach. When you take food and you use it to nourish yourself, who's dedicated to the service of God, so the food is fueling your service of God. The fuel is fueling your chesed, your tzedakah, your tefillah, your davening, your learning Torah. The food you're eating is fueling that. That's a korban. And the table is therefore a mizbeach. On the table there needs to be salt. To realize what kind of food you're eating, that changes. If you're French, it's one kind of food. If you're Moroccan, it's a different kind of food. If you're a Litvish Yid, it's a different kind of food. The food changes. If you're living in the 12th century, it's one kind of food. If you're living in the 21st century, it's another kind of food. But there's always salt. Oh, that doesn't change. What you do changes. What you eat changes. How you eat never changes. How you live your life never changes. It's on the mizbeach specifically that there has to always be melach, and particularly introduced to us through the Korban Mincha, because as Hirsch says, it's the Korban Mincha that I might have thought not only allows but requires most flexibility and agility. And that is true in terms of what we do, but it's not true in terms of how we do it. Not only even for the mincha, but especially for the mincha. Al kol korban chad takriv melach, there's always got to be salt on the korban when we bring it onto the mizbeach.